My name is Thomas Stocks. I'm a lecturer at Loughborough College and I'm also a volunteer researcher at the University of Sheffield where I'm helping out with a couple of different projects. I'm an early career researcher. I just finished my PhD last year and I've really pitched this talk to master's students, PhD students, potentially other early career researchers that might be interested in measuring right-wing authoritarianism. So this talk is focused on measuring latent constructs, and I'm going to use right-wing authoritarianism as an example to look at a few different things. So I want to kind of emphasize the importance of familiarization with the development of latent constructs of interest, the importance of engaging with theoretical and conceptual divides, and making sure that you're reflecting on your scale choice a little bit. So some of the benefits I'm going to tap into throughout this talk are how your work is situated in the literature, how you can strengthen your work, how it could lead to awareness of other work or avenues for other researchers, and also the importance of familiarity with the constructs, the history of the constructs that you're using when your work is being reviewed, or when you're doing your viva. You don't want to be paired with an expert in one of the scale items you just threw in for good measure that you don't really know anything about. So hopefully that's something you can take away from this. Okay, so just to start then, I'm going to just give a very brief history of right-wing authoritarianism. So Altemeyer developed the concept as a refinement of the authoritarian personality, finding that 3 of an original 9 facets of authoritarianism co-varied to form a single attitudinal dimension. So those 3 facets were conventionalism, authoritarian aggression, and authoritarian submission. Conventionalism is very much about wanting to adhere to social norms. Authoritarian aggression might be associated with things like a desire to punish people that are transgressing social norms. It might be associated with military aggression potentially. And then authoritarian submission is more about desiring a strong leader, somebody in charge, somebody to tell you what to do. And this is associated with perceiving the world as a dangerous, threatening place. It emerged as a robust predictor of a range of socio-political phenomena, particularly different types of prejudice and intolerance, but also support for a range of authoritarian political positions. More recently, there's been a lot of interest in it around support for Trump, support for Brexit, and other right-wing populist movements. So as our understanding of right-wing authoritarianism evolved, researchers, particularly Feldman and Stenner, started to question a fundamental assumption of Altemeyer's right-wing authoritarianism. So rather than being a personality dimension which measures stable individual differences, right-wing authoritarianism isn't stable, and it appears to be reactive to socio-political circumstances, and in particular to threats. Now, the intervening role of threat in the relationship between right-wing authoritarianism and attitudinal expressions is of vital interest to researchers in this area. So what happens to authoritarians' political beliefs when they're under threat? Well, broadly speaking, they become more right-wing. And this is where an important division emerged in the literature. So in Feldman and Stenner's interactionist model, attitudinal positions linked to right-wing authoritarianism are dependent on threat. Without threat, authoritarianism appeared to be unrelated to variables that it normally explained. In this model, threat affects authoritarians by increasing the connection between their predispositions and socio-political attitudes, rather than by causing direct short-term changes in levels of any underlying authoritarian dispositions. In Duckett's dual-process motivational model, right-wing authoritarianism is a value-attitude-belief dimension that emerges as an expression of the motivational goal of safety from threats. So in this model, certain personality dispositions emerge from early experiences and socialization that encourages the adoption of worldviews. Right-wing authoritarianism emerges in response to the view that the world is a threatening place. Social dominance orientation, which is a similar but distinct value-attitude-belief dimension, emerges from the view that the world is inherently competitive and naturally hierarchical. So Duckett's model is interested in explaining both right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, and that's important. We'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so a range of scales have been developed for the purpose of measuring right-wing authoritarianism, but I'm going to use just two examples here. Both are short form scales that you're likely to come across if you decide that you want to use a measure of right-wing authoritarianism in a questionnaire or survey. Okay, so I just wanted to give you the chance to just have a quick look at the two different scales. So here we've got the very short authoritarianism scale. You can see that there are a number of different items. It's agree or disagree on a 5-point Likert scale. And there's items that tap into the different components of right-wing authoritarianism. So you've got some that are tapping into conservatism or authoritarian submission. You've got some that are tapping into conventionalism, and some that are tapping into authoritarian aggression as well. So there is some debate about the crossover with religiosity within this scale. Okay, and then you've got the authoritarian child-rearing values. So this was more of a scale of convenience. In 1992, it was found that these child-rearing values could be used as a substitute for larger right-wing authoritarianism scales. It was used to validate Feldman and Stener's interactionist theory of authoritarianism, and it's still used in the American National Election Survey and a range of research on authoritarianism. So it's been noted that this scale seems to tap primarily into the authoritarian submission component of right-wing authoritarianism and not conventionalism or authoritarian aggression. It's also, the theory behind this doesn't really tap into social dominance orientation. It's definitely easier to integrate social dominance orientation into your theory if you're drawing on Duckett's conceptualization of right-wing authoritarianism. So in the authoritarian child-rearing values measure, you're presented with pairs of qualities, and you're asked to select which you think is a more desirable quality for a child to have. Okay, so when it comes to making a choice between these two scales, and that's something that you are likely to be faced with, really, I think, if you're intending to measure right-wing authoritarianism. Well, the models tested by your hypotheses change in meaningful ways depending on how you're situating your work within the theory behind right-wing authoritarianism. It affects how your work fits in with existing literature. And also reflecting on your scale choices, even for less important scale items, might present opportunities to strengthen the wider theoretical framework of your research, or it might present you with opportunities to broaden the scope of your research potentially. Okay, so I'm going to just touch on a couple of these points using the example of some papers that I've been helping with here at the University of Sheffield. Okay, so I've been helping out recently on a paper that should be coming out quite soon on the effect of perceiving the pandemic as threatening on people's levels of nationalism and also people's anti-immigrant sentiment. So we expected here that the perceived threat of the pandemic would interact with authoritarianism to produce increased anti-immigrant sentiment and nationalism. So in this respect, we could have drawn here either on Duckett or Feldman and Stener's work and build pretty nice hypotheses to test with robust theoretical models behind them. However, anti-immigrant sentiment during the pandemic was a really crucial part of this paper, and social dominance orientation is a robust predictor of anti-immigrant attitudes. So bringing social dominance orientation into the mix allowed us to develop a more interesting narrative that reached out a little further into the literature on prejudice, and drawing on Duckett's work facilitated this aspect of the theory section. So bringing in social dominance orientation helped us to emphasise as well the importance of right-wing authoritarianism in this anti-immigrant response to threat, particularly in the context of the pandemic. So social dominance orientation is a consistent predictor of anti-immigrant sentiment, while right-wing authoritarianism predicts anti-immigrant sentiment when the immigrant is perceived as threatening. So in this respect, it made sense to use Duckett's scale because we're drawing a lot more on that branch of right-wing authoritarianism theory. Okay, so in the second paper that I've also helped out with a little bit, we were looking at different conspiracy theories and psychological and social determinants of belief in these conspiracy theories. In particular, we were interested in belief in conspiracies and misinformation associated with the pandemic. So again, we used Duckett's scale. So in this paper, we wanted to investigate psychological determinants of belief in COVID-related conspiracy theories and misinformation, there was a lot of past literature on the importance of social dominance orientation here. And drawing on Duckett's work again made it easier to integrate work on both right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. So in addition, the theory behind why right-wing authoritarianism might be associated with some conspiracy beliefs but not others, which was something that we built our hypotheses around, is predicated on whether or not the conspiracy conformed to the worldview of people high in right-wing authoritarianism. And so this concept of conspiracy theories presenting a worldview that might be compatible with your own worldview fit a little more neatly with Duckett's conceptualization of right-wing authoritarianism and what's driving it. Okay, so remember also that the authoritarian childrearing values measure only really mapped onto authoritarian submission. So while we were doing the search for literature when we were writing this, we found a preprint of a related paper that looked at the relationship between one of the subcomponents of right-wing authoritarianism, traditionalism, and social dominance orientation, with the willingness to spread misinformation or conspiracy theories about COVID. So I wanted to make 2 points here. So first, familiarity with the subcomponents of a latent construct that was one of many predictors that we were interested in alerted us to these findings which we might otherwise have missed. So being familiar with the latent construct here, being familiar with the history of the development of right-wing authoritarianism, having a deeper understanding about it, exposed us to literature that was really useful when it came to developing our theory and developing our hypotheses. But also, using Duckett's scale, which can be broken down into the different subcomponents of right-wing authoritarianism, meant that we can specifically look at the role of traditionalism in the future if we wanted to. So, moreover, it makes our data set more usable in this instance. So when we make our data available for public use, researchers might be specifically interested in continuing this line of research, continuing to look at the role of traditionalism in conspiracy ideation. So in that respect, we've created a more flexible data set by using a scale which can be broken down into the subcomponents. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to cover here. I've just to finish off, I have just a link to the 2 papers that I used as an example. But I hope that was useful, both for people that are thinking a little bit about wanting to include measures of right-wing authoritarianism and not really knowing where to start. Hopefully that gave you an idea of where you can go. But also for people who are just starting out, maybe developing questionnaires and surveys and things like that, and doing their own research, hopefully this gave you some idea about the importance of just going into depth with the history of the construct that you're throwing in there.